The simulation smelled like jasmine and copper, which Kale had always thought was an odd combination for something designed to make people forget they were slaves. She stood at the edge of the Veth Consortium's grand atrium, the entry threshold of what the aliens called the Valu, and what humans under occupation had taken to calling the Drift. And let the sensory cascade wash over her the way she'd trained herself to let things wash over her, completely, for exactly 4 seconds, and then gone. 4 seconds of jasmine and copper and the low, crimp, resonant thrum of bioluminescent architecture, curving overhead like the rib cage of something enormous. 4 seconds of watching the crowd. Humans and Veth, both, moving through the simulation's rendered space in costumes that ranged from historically incoherent to biologically impossible. A woman in an 18th century corset dancing with something that had 7 limbs and no discernible face. A man in a pressure suit from the early colonial period laughing at something a cluster of Veth juveniles had projected into the air between them, a joke Kale couldn't hear and wouldn't have understood anyway. People who had, in the span of 12 years, learned to laugh at alien jokes. That was occupation for you. 4 seconds. Then she let it go and became Lena again. Lena was easy to wear. Lena had been a resident of the Drift for 6 of the 12 years, since the Veth had folded their fleet out of the dark between Kepler 442 and Earth, and begun what they called the harmonization. A word that sounded gentle in every one of their 11 vocal registers, and meant something closer to placement. Lena was cheerful. Lena had regulars. Lena knew every bouncer by name and every shortcut in the simulation's rendered geography and 3 separate ways to get a drink that tasted like something that had once been fermented on a planet with a yellow sun. Lena was the kind of person the Veth surveillance architecture didn't flag, because the Veth had studied human psychology for a decade and concluded that happy people don't fight back. Kale was not a happy person. But she had been playing Lena for so long that sometimes, in the Drift's jasmine copper warmth, she had to remind herself of the difference. Sometimes the reminder took longer than it should. She moved through the crowd toward the inner corridor and the door that everyone called the gate, which was guarded by a Veth social oversight unit that the regulars had named Sable because it wore a rendered human form in matte black and had the kind of stillness that made you think of deep water. Sable was not a person. Sable was a node in the consortium's behavioral management network, which meant it was reading her biometrics and cross-referencing her social engagement patterns and calculating her deviation probability, and doing all of this in the time it took her to cover the last 20 meters. Which was why she smiled at it the way Lena smiled, broad and slightly unfocused, the smile of someone who has been having a wonderful time and expects to continue. Lena, the unit said, in the voice it had learned from human social cues, warm and slightly amused. It's been a while. 3 weeks, she said. I had things.
You always have things.
It tilted its rendered head in the way it had learned meant fond exasperation. The inner sanctum is operating on restricted access tonight. You'd need to qualify. She'd known this. She'd known it since the intercept 2 weeks ago, a fragment of Veth internal traffic that her handler in the resistance cell had decoded to mean the neural archive they'd been hunting. The stolen mapping of 1,500 human minds, taken during the first year of occupation and preserved somewhere in the consortium's closed network as a trophy or a research project or both, was being migrated. The sanctum was the only place inside the Drift with enough protected bandwidth to receive a transfer that size. The Veth were moving it tonight, which meant tonight was the only window, which meant Kale needed to get through that door. Qualify how, she said. Sable gestured toward the arena corridor with one rendered hand, and Kale felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the simulation's climate control. She stood in the mouth of the arena corridor for a moment before she moved. She didn't let herself hesitate. Hesitation in front of Sable's biometric monitoring was a flag, but she let herself look, which Lena would do. Wide-eyed and a little thrilled by the spectacle of it, the way a regular who had always watched from outside might look when given the chance to step in. The corridor itself was a slow curve, rising slightly, and the sounds from the arena came down it distorted. Crowd noise shaped by that perfect sphere into something that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, something that lived in your chest rather than your ears. She had seen people go into the arena. She had watched from the drift's upper tier, with a drink in her hand and Lena on her face, while human challengers cycled through their rounds, and the Veth crowd made their untranslatable noises. She had catalogued it the way she catalogued everything in the drift, quietly, specifically, in the part of her brain that remained Kale, regardless of what Lena was doing on the surface. She walked up the corridor. The arena was a room that the drift's designers had clearly built to satisfy something in the Veth aesthetic that humans found unsettling. Perfect sphere, 400 meters in diameter, with the floor curved so gently that you didn't notice it until you were standing at the center and realized that every direction was slightly downhill. The walls were translucent. The crowd watched from outside. Their faces were distorted by the curvature into something funhouse and wrong. The lighting was theatrical. Sharp pools of illumination on the arena floor, darkness above, the bioluminescent trim of the drift's architecture, pulsing at the edges like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. She spent the first 30 seconds in the arena doing nothing. This was deliberate. Challenge forms. The Veth athletes who plugged into the haptic network for what they called cultural exchange required a calibration period at the start of each encounter, during which they were reading the challenger's baseline movement patterns, heart rate, muscle activation sequences, the micro-expressions that crossed a human face when fear arrived. The calibration period was usually treated by human challengers as dead time. Stand there, look at your opponent, try to psych yourself up. Kale used it to look at the floor. The curve was subtle. 12 years ago, before the harmonization, she had been a structural engineer working on the second phase of the Meridian Deep Space Relay, and her understanding of load distribution and gravitational geometry was not theoretical. She stood at the center of the sphere and felt the grade of the floor through the soles of her boots, and did the calculation quickly and confirmed what the cell schematic had told her. The curve was consistent, every direction equally downhill, which meant the arena was, if you understood it correctly, not a trap but a tool. The challenge form resolved from stillness to motion without preamble. It came forward at a pace that was neither rushing nor cautious, the pace of something that had done this 46 times before and had a well-developed model of how it went. Kale had read the record. She knew the pace. She knew the reach advantage and the haptic network's damage threshold, and the 2 data points from the 2 human victories. The construction worker who had broken things through pure force, and the 11-year-old who had found the controls. She didn't have the construction worker's body or the 11-year-old's particular genius with systems. What she had was the structural engineer who still lived in her bones, and the curve of the floor, 45 years of human stubbornness compressed into 34 years of a single body. She fell down, not entirely, not a collapse, which would have read as surrender, but a stumble, a rolling fall that took her across 12 meters of arena floor, and left her on her side and, critically, left the challenge form, moving toward where she had been, rather than where she was. She came up with arena dust on her jacket, and her elbows screaming from the impact, and the crowd making a sound she couldn't translate but suspected meant something like confusion. The challenge form recalibrated. It was good. It was fast. It took approximately 1 second to model the new geometry and redirect. 1 second was enough. She had spent 2 years in the resistance learning that the right improvised tool at the right moment was worth more than any amount of conventional capability, and the right tool right now was the arena floor itself, the gentle curve that made every direction slightly downhill, and the challenge form's momentum, which its model of the fight had not accounted for, needing to arrest. She got low and she got under it and she pushed, and the challenge form's own velocity and the floor's geometry did the rest. It wasn't elegant. It probably didn't look like anything the Veth crowd category for. But when the form hit the curved wall, and the haptic network's damage threshold triggered, and the system called the round, she was standing, and the form was not. The crowd made a sound she still couldn't translate. She thought it might be the alien equivalent of something her grandmother used to say when the unexpected happened. Well, I'll be damned. The second round was harder. The challenge form had updated its model. It didn't run at her again. It waited, and it watched, and it did the thing Veth athletes apparently did when they were being careful. It mapped her in space, head tilting at precise intervals, calculating. Kale recognized the behavior because she'd seen the consortium's social oversight units do the same thing. It was trying to predict her. She stood still and let it map, let it calculate, let it build its model of Lena as threat. It would be based on the one piece of data it had. The stumble and push of round one, which it had already accounted for and would not fall for again. She could feel the calculation happening, not literally, but in the quality of the form's attention, the precision of those head tilts, the way it had stopped being an athlete and become something closer to a machine running a problem. She had felt that quality of attention before, Sable, from every consortium monitoring node she'd walked past in 6 years of being Lena. The Veth were very good at watching. They were very good at building models. She counted, internally, to 12. Then she started humming. It was a song her mother had sung in the kitchen of a house that didn't exist anymore, in a city that was now a Veth administrative hub. Charlebens, her mother had sung it while in the mornings before work, in the specific unhurried way of someone doing something by muscle memory while their mind was elsewhere. It was not a song that belonged in the drift's jasmine copper atmosphere. It was not a song that belonged in a haptic combat arena with a calculating alien form across from her, and a crowd of distorted faces watching, translucent walls. It was completely, categorically out of place. The challenge horn form's head stopped tilting. She watched the cessation happen, that precise, calibrated movement simply stopping, mid-tilt, while the form processed the new variable. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. She was moving before the first second was done. She crossed the distance the way her training had taught her. Low, committed, direct. She hit the form twice, hard, in the places where the haptic network's damage threshold was lowest, where the rendered form's structural integrity was supported by the fewest nodes. And the system called the round before the form had finished, deciding what to do about the singing. She was breathing hard. Her elbow screamed. The crowd made the untranslatable noise again, and she thought, that's 2. That's both rounds, that's enough. The gate opened. She walked through it while her elbow was still screaming, and did not let herself look at the crowd. Because looking at the crowd was what Lena would do, and she was done being Lena until she needed to be, again. The corridor beyond the gate was real, not rendered, not haptic, actual physical space inside the consortium station, occupied what had been the L4 Lagrange point of the Earth-Moon system, before the harmonization made such designations academic. The walls were Veth biocomposite, warm and slightly yielding underfoot, lit by something that wasn't quite bioluminescence and wasn't quite electricity but sat in the spectrum between them. She'd memorized the layout from the intercept fragments and a schematic that one of the cell's Veth infrastructure contacts had nearly died obtaining, so she knew. 60 meters, a junction, left at the junction, and then the sanctum. She was 30 meters from the junction when she smelled it. Not jasmine and copper, something else. A chemical signature that didn't belong in the Veth's biocomposite architecture that her brain filed under human before she consciously identified it. A specific kind of soap, mass-produced, the kind that the Resistance's supply lines still managed to move through occupied territories because the Veth monitoring architecture didn't flag. Personal hygiene products. She'd used it herself for 9 years. She knew the smell exactly. She stopped. She stood in the corridor and she listened. What she heard was a voice through the wall, speaking Veth, that had an accent she recognized the way you recognize a sound you've heard in dreams, imperfectly, distortedly, but undeniably. Her Veth was functional. She'd learned it from a cell member who'd spent a year as a consortium service contractor, picking it up in pieces, from context and necessity. She wasn't fluent, but she was sufficient. And through the biocomposite wall she caught fragments. Arrangement, security concluded. She found the secondary access that the schematic had marked, but the cell had assessed as inactive. And it was standing open, and through it she could see the sanctum's interior before she reached the main door. Admiral Beatriz Reyes was sitting at a Veth interface console in the center of the sanctum. Kale knew her face the way everyone in the Resistance knew her face. from the broadcasts that the cell distributed through occupied networks at irregular intervals, the ones that said, "We are still here, and we are still fighting, and we will not stop." Pree's face in those broadcasts was the face of someone who had not slept well in 12 years and did not intend to start. A woman in her late 50s with gray-streaked hair, cut short for function, and a jaw that looked like it had been designed to hold a line. She'd commanded the Meridian operation. She'd coordinated the Sao Paulo evacuation. She'd been the reason that somewhere between 60 and 90,000 people, the numbers depended on who you asked, had gotten off the surface in the first 18 months of occupation before the VETH locked the orbital transit corridors. She was the reason that the resistance still had a structure, rather than just a collection of desperate people doing desperate things in uncoordinated directions. She was sitting at a VETH interface console in the sanctum of the consortium station at L4, and the VETH official across from her was sliding a data lattice toward her across the console surface, and she was taking it. Kale watched. She told herself. Wait, she told herself. Look for the other explanation, the one where this is not what it looks like, the one where Reyes is here undercover, the way you are here undercover, where this is a cell operation you weren't briefed on, because compartmentalization, where the data lattice is going somewhere useful after this. She had been trained to look for the other explanation. She had been trained to assume good faith in allies until the evidence for bad faith was unambiguous, because the resistance ran on trust, and trust eroded under suspicion, and you couldn't afford to lose allies to misreading. She watched for 4 seconds. She watched the way her training had taught her to watch, for the body language that lies, and the body language that doesn't, for the tells that people maintain under their conscious performance, things the body does, involuntarily, when it is in a situation that the mind has decided to conceal. She watched Reyes's hands close around the data lattice. Both hands, deliberate, the grip of someone receiving something they have been waiting to receive. She watched Reyes's face, was doing something she had never seen in any of the broadcasts. Relief. Not the guarded, temporary relief of someone completing a dangerous operation. The relief of someone who has put down something heavy and does not intend to pick it again. The conversation across the console was in VETH. She caught arrangement, security, concluded. Then a phrase that she had to parse twice before she was certain she understood it. A phrase that in VETH carried a meaning close to the English protected, but with a connotation of protected from, rather than protected for. She stopped telling herself to wait for the other explanation. She had been in the resistance for 9 years. She had been Kale for 9 years, and Lena for 6 of them, and herself, the version of herself that existed before the harmonization, the structural engineer who sang in the morning and had plans for a second phase relay and a cat named after a dead physicist, for exactly the time took to think of her mother's kitchen. And then she had to put that version away again, because it was too expensive. In 9 years, she had made decisions in bad situations with incomplete information, and she had gotten most of them right, and some of them wrong. The ones she'd gotten wrong had cost people. She cared about things they couldn't get back. She understood the math of operational decisions. She understood that you could know a thing, and not have to ask whether you were seeing it correctly. She was seeing this correctly. Question that remained the only question was what she did with it. The easy answer was the obvious one. Document, withdraw, port to the cell leadership, hand it up the chain, let the people with broader visibility and greater authority make the call. This was, by any reasonable standard of resistance tradecraft, the correct procedure. Kale had not survived 9 years by ignoring correct procedure. Correct procedure assumed the chain was clean. Correct procedure assumed the cell leadership hadn't been receiving information filtered through a commander who was, for whatever reason, coercion, exhaustion, ideology, the simple human weight of 12 years of watching everything you'd built be slowly dismantled, feeding something to the other side. Procedure assumed a lot of things that the image of Beatriz Reyes closing her hands around a VETH data lattice with an expression of relief just made significantly less certain. She thought about what it would take to break Reyes. Not rhetorically, actually. She thought about 12 years of building something and watching it erode. She thought about the people the Admiral had put in the field, and the ones who had come back, and the ones who hadn't, and how you maintained a structure of purpose around a growing absence at its center, and what it would feel like when the math of loss finally outweighed the math of hope. She could imagine the breaking. She could see its shape. She couldn't excuse it, but she could see it, which she thought was important. She thought was the difference between understanding and judgment. And she needed to understand before she could act, because acting without understanding was how you made the same mistake, twice in different actions. She thought about the archive, 1,500 mapped minds. She thought about what the Veth did with mapped minds. The Resistance's xenocognition analysts had been piecing together for 3 years from fragments and horror. They ran them, not as simulations, not as models, but as experiences. The Veth had a word for it, a word that translated closest to resonance, which meant they played human minds back to themselves and watched the output was either research or art or entertainment, and probably all three simultaneously, depending on the node in the consortium network doing the watching. 1,500 people. Some of them probably still alive on the surface, walking around with a piece of themselves in Veth storage, unaware that their interior landscape was being experienced by something that could process every harmonic of their memories and generate from those inputs a model of what kind of creature made those sounds, and use that model for whatever the consortium used such models for. She thought, that is what Reyes traded access for. That archive, moving through the sanctum tonight. Reyes knew it was here. Reyes knew the cell was looking for it. And Reyes had let the window be tonight. The cold settled in her chest and she held it there and did not let it move. She moved to the wall. The biocomposite surface was warm under her fingers and slightly yielding. The Veth built their interiors to feel organic, was either an aesthetic choice or a psychological one, and possibly both. She found the infrastructure node that the schematic had marked as the sanctum's network interface, the physical point at which the sanctum connected to the drift simulation architecture, and from there to the consortium station's broader network. The node was a protrusion in the wall, no larger than her palm, covered by a biocomposite panel that she needed 30 seconds and a specific amount, pressure to remove. She'd practiced on a mock-up in the cell's training space, with the tech specialist watching, and not saying anything encouraging, which was its own kind of encouragement. The panel came free. The node beneath was exactly what the schematic had described. She'd carried the override tool for 6 weeks. Small enough to look like a piece of jewelry, a ring, worn on her right index finger, with a band that was actually a coiled filament and a setting that was actually an interface chip. She had worn it as Lena for 6 weeks. And Sable had read it as decorative, and the crowd in the drift had not thought twice, because Lena was the kind of person who wore interesting jewelry. Her handler had given it to her in a basement under what had been Buenos Aires, and the tech specialist had explained its function 3 times, prefacing each explanation with an increasingly resigned acknowledgement that she was going to use this wrong. And she'd listened carefully each time and understood enough, and was now about to find out if enough was sufficient. She plugged in. The node's response was immediate, not an alarm, not a lockout, but a query. It was what the tech specialist had told her to expect. The Veth built their networks to ask questions rather than close doors, because closing doors created pressure and pressure was legible, and legibility was a vulnerability. The query was in Veth text. Identify access purpose. She typed with the clumsy haptic interface the override tool provided, letter by letter. Migration support. The node responded. Migration is in progress. Please specify operational role. She had 4 things in the override tool's memory that the tech specialist had loaded before she'd left. 3 of them were authentication fragments, stolen from Veth network traffic over 18 months by 3 different cell members who had not known what they were stealing, who had been told they were pulling routine signals intelligence, and had pulled it routinely, unremarkably, without knowing that somewhere in the extracted data was something that could open a network door. One of them was a message, her handler's voice, recorded in that basement under Buenos Aires, In the slow and careful tone that meant she was saying something she'd thought about for a long time. If you get to the interface and the migration is live, we need you to make a choice. We built this tool to redirect. You could take the archive, pull it to an isolated address outside consortium access, and it would be gone from their system. Or you could destroy it. I can't tell you which one to do because I can't know what you'll find when you get there, and that's the job. I'm sorry about that. I mean it. She sat on the floor of the corridor, with her back against the biocomposite wall, and the override tool warm in her palm, and both options in front of her, and thought about it for 15 seconds, which was the longest she could afford. 1,500 people's minds. The architecture of 1,500 interior lives. The specific weight of specific memories. Particular way each person had learned to love and fear and want. The things they believed when they were most honest with themselves. The songs they hummed in kitchens. If she redirected, she could get them somewhere the Veth couldn't reach. A resistance data vault. An isolated server. Cluster on one of the outer settlements where the Veth monitoring architecture was thinner. It would mean those maps existed somewhere safe. Which was not the same as those people being safe. But it was not nothing. And it would mean the Veth lost the archive. A trophy. A research trove. Something with operational significance the cell's analysts had been trying to quantify for 3 years. Redirecting meant the Veth knew the archive had moved. The migration would register as redirected, not failed. They would start following the redirect. They were very good at following things. Eventually, the consortium's analytical resources was not very long. They would find the direction. The direction would lead to a chain of infrastructure. And the chain would lead to people. And the people would lead to more people. And somewhere in that sequence the resistance would lose something it couldn't recover. Destroying meant the archive was gone. Unrecoverable. 1,500 maps of human interior lives, annihilated by a protocol that would register as catastrophic network failure at the migration node, which would register as an internal consortium error, which would be investigated and found inconclusive, which was as close to invisible as she could get. The Veth would lose their archive. The resistance would lose nothing additional. 1,500 people whose minds had been captured and stored and experienced as alien entertainment would remain. Unrescued, yes, unexposed. And their capture would not be the weapon that led the consortium to the Resistance's hidden infrastructure. She did the math. She hated the math. She sat on the floor and hated it, and did it anyway. Because the math was the job, and the job was what kept people alive, and being alive was the precondition for everything else. She thought about the song from her mother's kitchen. She thought about what it would mean to have that song played back. Not to her, to something that could process every harmonic, and every pause, and every variation, and generate from those inputs a model of what kind of person sang that kind of song, not understanding it, running it, using the running of it to understand, in the Veth sense of understanding, was thorough and cold and deeply missing the point of the thing. She thought about 1,500 people who did not get a vote on this. She thought about Reyes. She activated the destruction protocol. The node was quiet for 3 seconds. Then the sanctum's lighting changed. A flicker barely perceptible, the kind of thing you'd attribute to a power fluctuation if you weren't looking. She heard. Distantly, the Veth official's voice shift register, not alarm, which would have been obvious and actionable, but a recalibration, the sound of someone checking a reading that hadn't matched their expectation. Then another voice, quieter, asking a question she couldn't fully parse, and the Veth official responding with a phrase she understood. Error at source. She pulled the override tool from the node and pressed the biocomposite panel back into place and stood up. She heard Reyes's voice through the secondary access. Speaking in Veth, better than Kale's, smoother, the Veth of someone who'd had reason to learn it properly. And she understood enough to know. Reyes was saying the archive was gone. She was saying the migration had failed. She was saying she didn't understand how, and her voice had a quality in it that Kale had heard in her own voice a few times. In the moments after something she'd built carefully had come apart in her hands. The Veth official's response was longer and colder, and Kale understood less of it, But she understood the register, which was the register of someone performing a rapid revaluation. A deal whose primary currency had ceased to exist, she thought. That's not justice, she thought. It's what's available. She walked back down the corridor toward the gate. Sable was waiting at the entrance to the drift, in its rendered warmth, and it looked at her with the slight tilt that meant assessment. Done already, it said. The sanctum was a disappointment, she said, which was true in more directions than Sable's monitoring architecture would be able to parse. They often are, Sable said, with the warmth it had learned from human social cues. And the sentence landed wrong in a way she couldn't quite name, except that it was the sentence of something that had learned to say true things without understanding them. Which was, she thought, its own kind of portrait. She walked back into the drift. The crowd was still moving. The costumed figures, human and Veth, still cycled through their pleasures. The jasmine and copper smell held, as it always held, because the Veth had calibrated it to produce a specific neurochemical effect in human. Olfactory architecture and the calibration was very good. A man near the atrium entrance was laughing. Really laughing. The full-body kind. At something a Veth juvenile had done with a holographic projection. The laugh was real. The drift was very good at producing real things inside a false container. That was its function. That was what made it work. She found a quiet corner behind a rendered column and stood in it for a moment. The grief came quietly, which was how it usually arrived. Not as a wave but as a settling, a weight that distributed itself through her chest and her hands and the space behind her eyes. She let it settle. She had learned not to fight the settling, because fighting it made it louder, and she needed to be quiet right now. Needed the part of herself that felt things to be doing its work in the background, while the part of herself that operated kept operating. She was good at the parallel processing. 9 years made you good at it. She thought about Reyes. She tried one more time to find the frame in which what Reyes had done was something other than what it was. She could hear the case. She could hear it in the abstract, in the voice of someone who had been doing this longer than she had, and who had reached a point where the ledger of loss outweighed the ledger of possibility. You could make the argument. 12 years was a long time. The structure that Reyes had built had been eroding for all 12 of them, piece by piece, person by person, operation by operation. You could trace a line from that erosion to a moment in a consortium sanctum where a woman who had once evacuated 90,000 people closed her hands around a data lattice and felt, for the first time in more than a decade, something like relief. You could trace the line and you could name each point on it. Naming a thing was not the same as excusing it, she thought. The cell doesn't know. The cell thinks Reyes is the structure. The cell has been operating around Reyes's information for years, trusting that the intelligence they received was clean, that the compromises were operational rather than fundamental. The cell doesn't know that the commander at the center of their network has been, for some unknown period of time, concluding arrangements with the people they are fighting. She thought, I have to tell someone. The problem was that she didn't know who. The cell's leadership had been receiving information filtered through Reyes's command structure, and she had no way of knowing where she was standing, what was clean and what had been shaped. The wrong call would not just end the operation, it would end people, in the specific, physical, irreversible way that resistance work ended people. She had one option that wasn't mediated by the cell structure. She had a contact outside the formal network, the kind of contact that resistance tradecraft strongly discouraged, and that she'd maintained anyway, exactly this kind of situation, because 9 years had given her a very clear-eyed view of when correct procedure was insufficient. A woman named Soo-Jin Park, who had been an orbital transit engineer before the harmonization, and who now moved through the occupied territories with a skill that Kale respected in the abstract, and had never been able to fully explain to the cell, without revealing that she'd been maintaining an unauthorized contact. Park was very good at getting information to places it needed to go without the information knowing where it was going. Park moved things through channels that didn't touch the formal resistance architecture. Park was, by any reasonable assessment, exactly the kind of resource you needed when the formal architecture had been compromised at its center. Kale would find Park. Park would move the information. And from there it would go somewhere with enough independence from Rhea's influence to act on it without the acting, being visible to Reyes before the action was complete. She pushed off the rendered column and walked toward the exit. She was almost at the drift's outer threshold when she heard it. From behind her, from the arena corridor, a sound she hadn't heard before. The Veth crowd, inside the sphere, making a noise she didn't have a category for. She paused and let herself listen. It was different from the untranslatable noises she'd heard during the fight. Louder, more sustained, with a quality that her brain kept trying to parse as anticipation, and kept failing to fully land on, because anticipation implied a future event. This sounded more like the response to something that had already happened. Like recognition. Like a crowd encountering a thing they had not known they were waiting for, and finding that the encounter explained something they hadn't known, was unexplained. She thought. The two human victories in the record. The construction worker. The 11-year-old. She thought about what the Veth crowd had made of those, which she hadn't been present for, she'd only seen in the reaction. Records the cell's monitoring had pulled. The records had described the crowd response as significant in ways the analyst hadn't been able to categorize. She thought, maybe the Veth come to the arena to watch humans lose, and when a human wins, they don't know how to feel about it. And maybe that not knowing how to feel is the most important thing that happens in the drift. The one moment when the controlled environment produces an uncontrolled response. The one crack in the designed experience where something real gets through. She didn't look back. She stepped out of the drift and into the station's public corridor, which smelled of nothing, which was its own kind of information. Real spaces had smells, or the absence of smells, and both were real. And the drift's persistent calibrated jasmine copper was neither. The corridor's functional emptiness was the contrast that told her what the drift was. She walked, and kept walking, and let the distance between herself and the jasmine copper accumulate, and breathed the nothing smell of real air. Elbow stopped hurting around the third junction. She noticed this without particular interest, and cataloged it, and kept going. The body was good at moving forward once the mind had decided to move forward, which was one of the things she had always liked about it. Stubbornness, its forward-leaning bias. You could be in grief and operational simultaneously. The body understood this instinctively. It kept walking. She was thinking about the cell, about what she'd need to reconstruct in the next 72 hours, which contacts were clean, which were potentially compromised, which were unknowable, without further information that she would need Park to help her develop. She was thinking about the archive and the choice she'd made, and trying to decide how to hold it. Not as a loss, because you could not afford to hold operational necessities as losses, but also not as nothing, because it wasn't nothing, and pretending otherwise was the first step toward the kind of ethical erosion that sat in a sanctum and felt relief when it closed a deal. She held it as what it was. A choice made in 15 seconds with the information available, in the direction that the math pointed, people who hadn't been consulted, about whom she would carry the specific weight of that unconsultation, for as long as she carried anything. That was correct. That was the appropriate weight. She would not make it heavier than it was, and she would not make it lighter. She found a public terminal at the junction, nearest the station's civilian access corridor, and opened the messaging function and composed, in the encoding that she and Park had agreed on before the harmonization. In a basement in a city that was now a Veth administrative hub, a message of 11 words that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't been in that specific basement, on that specific night when they had been two engineers who were not yet resistance, and had agreed, over bad coffee, to stay connected, no matter what the next 12 years brought. The message said, found the thing, need the thing moved. The house is compromised, she sent it. She stood for a moment at the terminal after the message had gone, her hands still on the input surface, and let herself feel, for exactly 4 seconds, which she had learned was the right amount, the specific quality of what the day had been, the jasmine and copper of the drift, the arena floor coming up to meet her back, the crowd making its untranslatable noises, the warm wall of the corridor, the 15 seconds, Reyes's face through the secondary access, And what the relief on that face said about how long the weight had been there before it was put down. Her handler's voice in the basement recording, saying, "I'm sorry about that. I mean it." 4 seconds. Then she let it go. She walked toward the civilian exit, and her step was even, and her face was Lena's face one last time tonight, just long enough to get through the final checkpoint, where the Veth monitoring architecture would read her biometrics and her social engagement pattern and her deviation probability and file her as a regular returning from an evening in the drift, unremarkable, unthreatening, uninteresting. The checkpoint processed her in 0.3 seconds. The door opened. She walked through it. Somewhere behind her in the sanctum, a Veth official was delivering a revised assessment of a concluded deal to a woman who was about to discover that the currency of that deal had ceased to exist. Somewhere in the cell's distributed architecture, 72 hours of reconstruction work was waiting. Somewhere in the station's network, a migration that had begun tonight had ended in silence. 1,500 maps of human interior lives were nowhere. Which was not the same as gone, she told herself. Which was not the same as lost. Because what those minds had been was already scattered across the world's memory, in the people who had loved them, and the choices those people had made because of them, and the songs that came from kitchens that still existed, somewhere in someone's body, even when the kitchens didn't. You couldn't archive that. You couldn't migrate it. You couldn't model it. The Veth could map a mind and play it back with perfect fidelity, could process every harmonic and every pause, generate from those inputs a comprehensive portrait of what kind of creature made those sounds. And they would still be missing the point so fundamentally that the gap between their model and the actual thing was not a measurement error, but a different category of existence entirely. That was the thing. That had always been the thing. The Veth were very good at modeling humans. They had had 12 years and billions of data points, and the mapped interior lives of 1,500 people. And they had built, from all of it, the drift, a system so well calibrated to human neurochemistry that it produced real laughter and real relaxation and real forgetting in the people who entered it. They had built Sable, with its learned warmth and its fond exasperation and its precise social cues. They had built the challenge form, with its real-time biometric modeling and its rapid recalibration and its impressive record against human challengers. They were very, very good. What they could not do, what the record showed, in its 2 anomalous victories and its handful of significant crowd responses, and the 11-year-old who had done something unexplained with the environmental controls, was fully predict the specific, the individual. The thing that Kale did in the arena that Lena would never have done, that neither Lena nor Kale had planned to do. That came from somewhere in the overlap between training and instinct, and a song that a dead woman had, sung in a kitchen that was now an administrative hub. The Veth could model the population-level behavior of humans under stress with impressive accuracy. They could not model the decision that an individual human made in a corridor with an override tool in her palm, and 15 seconds to think. Because that decision came from everything that person was, not the aggregate of human behavior, not the statistical pattern, the specific weight of specific grief, and specific love, and specific stubbornness, and the exact quality of a particular morning in a particular kitchen, which was not a variable, which was not a data point, which was not something you could store and run and call resonance. 8 billion of them. 8 billion particular arguments, none of them fully modelable, all of them alive and changing and making decisions in corridors with 15 seconds and incomplete information and the weight of everything they were. The Veth, for all their competence and all their patience and all their 12 years of study, trying to solve for a variable that kept changing, because the variable was not a variable, but a person. She walked out into the observation gallery, where the station's outer hull was transparent, and the Earth turned below. Still blue, still unhurried, still making its argument with the indifference of something that had been making it for 4 billion years before the Veth arrived, and would be making it long after any particular arrangement had been concluded or failed or burned quietly in a network node in a sanctum at L4. She found the window. She stood in front of it with her hands at her sides. She did not hum. That would come later. The humming came back when the work was done. And you were somewhere that smelled like something real. And you let yourself be, for a moment, person who knew that song before everything else. She was safe for a later. She had learned, in 9 years, that later was not a luxury. Later was a plan. It was the thing you kept working toward, even when the present was the corridor and the override tool and the 15 seconds and choice. Later meant you were still here. Later meant the argument was still being made. Later meant the variable was still changing. Park would receive the message. The information would move. The resistance would reconstruct itself around a cleaner center, because it had done this before. It had lost things it couldn't afford to lose and rebuilt around the loss and kept going, because what the Veth had not yet modeled was that the stubbornness of humans was not a trait but a structure. Not a characteristic but an architecture, built into the same bones that kept walking after the elbow stopped hurting, that kept humming after the kitchen was gone, that kept working in the silence after a hard thing was decided. You couldn't archive that. You could only live it. The earth turned below her, patient and blue, and she stood in front of the window and breathed the nothing smell of real air. And in a minute she would go find Park, and the minute after that she would begin the work of rebuilding what could be rebuilt. But first, 1 minute. Just the window and the turning earth and the weight of the day distributed through her chest and her hands, being held the appropriate amount and no more. 4 seconds for the feeling, then the rest of the minute for the next thing, and then the next thing. She had learned that this was how you stayed human in occupied territory. You felt what you felt for exactly as long as you could afford to feel it, and then you moved. And you kept the feeling in your pocket like a tool you'd need later. And you trusted that later would come, and you made it come, and when it came you were still there to meet it. The Veth had not modeled this either. She was counting on that.